Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Runners Roundtable, where in season 4, I am speaking to different women within the running community that are doing their part to make the running community and the running industry as a whole better. And today I am joined by Bethan Taylor-Swaine, and I'm really excited to have you here. I actually just recently started following you, and it was in this post-Tracksmith saga that I discovered you, because I went down a rabbit hole. Like, with all of that, I went down a rabbit hole. I was checking who was tagging Tracksmith. I don't follow Tracksmith. And I know there are people that are like, okay, can we please just get over this whole situation already? But I went down the rabbit hole because I am always so curious as to how we can make running better for everyone, and in particular, how we can make running better for women. So I came across your account and I saw feminist sociologist, and I'm like, wait, this is someone that I absolutely need to talk to, because one, you're a lady, and two, you're a runner, and three, there's sports psychology. And I just remember reading what you wrote about everything having to do with Tracksmith and thinking, how do we let things like that just slide? Like, how are we okay with stuff like, how are we okay with companies behaving like that? So we can kind of go into the Tracksmith stuff. But first, can you introduce yourself to us and let us know how you got into this wonderful sport of running?
Okay, so my name's Bethan Taylor-Swaine. I'm a runner. I write things. I'm a sociologist of sport, which means I predominantly study running as my area of interest. I'm currently trying to finish writing my PhD, which looks at the representations and identities of women in ultramarathon. Um, and I'm an advocate for change in the running world and talking about how we can make running accessible in hopefully helping people understand more about the barriers that exist to participation at a societal level. So I'm really interested in gender ideology, how that manifests in society, because it's insidious. We don't realize we're doing it. Like, I mean, I fall foul of gender ideology all the time, and I'm doing a PhD in it. So it's there. It's part of what shapes our culture and shapes our society. But being more aware of it does help promote change. And a lot of my work is also around discourse analysis, which is understanding how we use words and what words we use. And so a great example today was there's a UK initiative called This Girl Can, which is about encouraging more women to participate in physical activity. It's been very successful, hugely successful campaign, but equally there are some elements of it that are slightly problematic. So the use of the word girl, for example, isn't actually very inclusive, because that excludes anybody over 18 technically, but can be quite alienating. But actually today they put up a post about asking what would make you feel safer exercising after dark. And the bit I took issue with was the feel. What would make you feel safer? Because actually words like that put the responsibility on women for an issue that is not of their making. You know, we didn't choose to live in a society where venturing out after dark feels like a threat, where every man you encounter after dark, however benign they are, feels threatening. And actually those type of questions, challenging the use of the word feel, is quite important. Instead, they could have asked, what would make you safer? And that's very different. And a lot of people felt the same way as me. The comments on the post underneath were very much in a similar vein, and they actually reached out to talk to me about it and things like that. So that's been quite interesting. But yeah, that's what I do most of the time.
Yeah. And how did you come to the sport of running?
Yes, it's an interesting question. The official story is about 10 years ago, maybe 10 years, yeah, about 10 years ago. I really felt like I needed a hobby. So I tried loads and loads of things and couldn't really find what I was looking for. But the thing I kept coming back to, or the idea I kept coming back to, was running. And I'd always been horrifically rude about running. I didn't really see the point of it. And why would you want to do that? But it kept niggling at me. It kept niggling at me. So I decided I'd learn how to run. And I knew after the first session that this was something that had the potential to have a very positive impact on my life. And I mean, it's entirely changed the direction of my life. I wouldn't do the work that I do if I hadn't have gone out for that first initial run. I probably wouldn't be living where I live. I wouldn't have met my partner. My life would have looked very, very different. But actually, in the last few years, I've come to realize that I actually started running a long time before that. Because when I was like maybe 15, 16, I went to the school where my dad was a teacher, which was an interesting experience for all sorts of reasons. But he managed to persuade the PE department that I didn't have to do team sports because I was notoriously bad at them. And instead, I'd go cross country running round Blenheim Palace, which is a big kind of country estate in Oxfordshire where we lived at the time. And I'd go cross country running for an hour or so because I was preparing to go on a month-long expedition to South America and needed to kind of get endurance fitness up. So yeah, I'd been running for a lot longer than I thought I had. I just had kind of blanked that bit out of my memory.
Well, it's like running then had a different purpose, right? Like
Yeah,
running then was to prepare you for that trip, whereas
yeah.
running now it's something more for you, it sounds like.
It's
How,
something quite different now.
yeah, how would you say the running landscape has changed since you started running the second time around?
Oh wow. Um, I mean, I've changed a lot during that time as well. So I think that's worth keeping in mind. I feel like there, in terms of ultra running, which is kind of what I study the most, there's it's definitely become more prominent. It's still very much, there's a phrase that another academic uses called, where they refer to it as being on the edges of endurance, and it is still very much on the edges of endurance, but it's becoming more common. More people know about it, are talking about it. It's become a progression for runners. Didn't used to get to marathon and people would just go and do loads of marathons, whereas now people kind of, some of the people I interviewed for my PhD kind of were talking about how it's the next logical step, which I thought was really interesting. Obviously, there's gradually more money getting involved, which will change the landscape. I think that has its pros and cons. I know that some of the kind of old guard in the community are not big fans of that, of kind of the big brands coming in and obviously influencing running in the way that big brands do. It's being featured more in mainstream press, at least in the UK. So The Guardian, which is one of the kind of left-leaning newspapers, has a surprising number of staffers who ultra and there's quite often articles in there, people like Naren Finn, who is a journalist who's written extensively about it, and that type of thing. So it is on more people's radar. More people understand what it is. It's not just a bunch of kind of lunatics in short shorts off on a hill somewhere, which is great. But it has morphed and changed. It's not mainstream by any stretch of the imagination. I think in running's become quite sexy in the last 10 years. It's got quite trendy. Like things like, even things like, we have much bigger choice of kit as women now than we did 10 years ago. Like 10 years ago, kind of thinking back, it was starting to change, but at least the UK is usually a little bit behind the US. So we didn't have Lululemon, or we had a couple of showrooms
Mm-hmm.
and stuff like that. And it was all still quite shrink it and pink it and functional. Whereas now you have so much more choice at every price point as well, which is improvement. Whether or not that is size inclusive always is a different question, because size inclusivity continues to be an issue in sportswear. But at least in regular sizing, you're getting more choice. than we used to, say, comparatively to 10 years ago. And it's definitely not all pink anymore, which is quite nice. Shoe technology, the price of shoes is just changed so much as well.
Yeah, the shoes are the one that I always take issue with because
Yeah.
I started running, I always say, to the capacity that I run today, like with the consistency that I run today
Yeah.
in 2012. And I remember getting shoes for like $100, 110.
Yeah.
And that was brand new. And my first running shoe was the Brooks Ghost. And I
Oh,
do
so was mine.
remember, yeah, I do remember those days of them being like $110.
Yeah.
Like it was great. And now, I mean, your quote unquote entry level shoe, or your quote unquote like your workhorse shoe, you're looking at $150 minimum
Yeah.
for a shoe, unless you're getting them on sale. And even then, you're getting them on sale like an older model. And even now, that's what breaks my heart with the shoe technology. I appreciate that it is changing and it's improving, but sometimes there's such vast differences between the models that it's like a totally different shoe.
Yeah.
But I agree with you in terms of the clothing and how much that has changed, because that, for me, when I started running, I remember it being cotton, right? Like a lot of cotton, or kind of
Yeah.
more like polyester. I don't know. I just remember it.
Like shiny,
Yeah.
shiny and crinkly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was just weird. But now
Hmm.
there's definitely, to your point of, there's so many different brands, there's so many different price points, that in that way, at least clothing wise, it has become more accessible. Shoe wise, it's, to me, it's something else, which is,
Oh, yeah.
I personally take issue when people say running is free, everyone should run. And I'm like, but have you actually tried to try to engage in the
Oh,
sport
you're
in a way
frozen.
that is
You
free?
there?
I mean, it's kind of hard. Yeah, you can put on some shoes and go outside to run, and that's free. But then what if you put on some shoes, you go out to run, and you get injured because the shoes aren't the right shoes for you, and then all of a sudden you're paying money for physical therapy, you know? So that's kind of where I take issue with it. Oh, let's see.
She's back.
I'm back. You know, it's been a minute since I've had internet issues, but it's always gonna come back.
That's
And
fine.
so we'll see. Remember how I told you this conversation is gonna be what it is, and it's
Yep.
gonna just show two real people having a conversation, and that's kind of what's happening here. I had to turn on the hotspot on my phone to connect here, because if anyone knows or follows me on Instagram, you know that I have been moving around because my house is under construction, and every place that we move to, the Wi-Fi gets significantly worse. So here we are. We were talking about shoes, and we were talking about
Yes.
accessibility of clothing and accessibility just in general as a
Yep.
sport. And I was sharing my own frustrations with people when they say that running is free, and that running is not always free. And that
Yep.
even if you approach it in a way that's free, that free approach might lead to injury or something that then does have some kind of cost, like through a physical therapist or whatnot.
Absolutely. Like I did a post on this with an illustration a little while back. You might have to scroll deep to find it. But essentially, I costed up how much it would take to start running, just based on, so I don't know if you have it in the States. There's a store called Decathlon here,
Mm-mm.
which is like a big box store for sports. And they're a great company actually. Their whole goal is to make every sport as accessible as possible to people. And I did some work with them a few years ago where I went out to France and kind of got to meet all their climbing and outdoors people and look at their design process. And they really designed to make things sustainable, good quality, but at a really good entry level price point. So I had a look on their website, and for the absolute basics, which includes like their pretty basic shoe, which comes in at $39.99, which I don't think you'd want, unless you really get on with it, it's not a shoe that you'd probably want to upgrade once you kind of started really getting into things. You're looking at £75 to £80, depending on whether or not you bought shorts or leggings, which is actually a huge amount of money. And like, even a couple of days ago, my mum was buying new running shoes because she's training for a half marathon at the moment that I'm going to run with her next year. And she needed new running shoes. And the ones we were looking at, which are standard Asics workhorse shoes, nothing fancy, £140. And like, we shopped around and we managed to get her a pair on sale. And like, Asics are generally quite good. They don't tend to overtech their shoes. They tend to be consistent. But it's shocking amounts of money. And a lot of people, that, particularly in the UK, where we are currently having quite a difficult time financially, like food costs and things are housing, everything is astronomical here. That's a lot of money out of people's budgets, if they can find that money. So yeah, it absolutely infuriates me whenever anyone says that running is free, because I'm like, no, it's not. Like, it's a luxury good. And it's also time and resources, kind of particularly for women. Time is a stretched resource. Women are quite often assume caring responsibilities by default, even down to the structures within the UK. When your child's born, their medical records are automatically registered to the mother. So any medical thing for my daughter, it's me who gets the call, even though, you know, her dad's around and actively involved and things like that. And the same with childcare and all that type of stuff. So finding that kind of time to do things is a cost. What do you not do? So like, the only reason I did London Marathon earlier this year, and the only reason I could do it was because my husband did all the household stuff while I trained. So that means only one of us can train at a time.
Right. I did that, I think it was maybe last year. I did a post on Instagram, and it's probably the only post I've ever had that was like controversial. And it was me just sharing how much everything I was wearing cost, from the watch, the road ID, from my belt, my hat, my headlamp. It was ridiculous how much everything
money
cost. Like, everything. I'm like, so there's a sports bra, and then there's special running underwear that I wear. And then there's the socks that's not regular socks. There's special running socks, and the shoes. And I tallied it up, and it was so great, because I had people in that post responding with, you don't have to get clothes that expensive. You don't have to get fuel that expensive. The shoes that I wear, I bought we have Walmart here. And that was one of the comments. It was like, I bought the shoes from Walmart 15 years ago and I'm still wearing them. So you don't have to spend that much on shoes.
Wow.
The comments were great. Like, I just saw it and I was like, this is like amazing, because people really, they really got their feathers were ruffled by this post. And my response to all of that was, that's great if that works for you. Like, if your body can handle being in shoes from Walmart from 15 years ago, that's awesome. My body, it can't. My body, if I'm wearing shoes that I have more than like 300 miles on them, my shins start to hurt. If I like, like, there's certain
the mere thought of it, I am getting like,
it's so parts. Yeah. And it's also like, I tried to explain to people as well. I'm like, well, this is the clothes that I don't chafe in. Like, that's a big part of it. But also part of that post was the invisible costs of running, which is to your point of, I have 2 daughters. My daughters are older, so they're 13 and 11 years old. But in all the time that I was running, when I trained for my first half marathon, when I trained for my first marathon, I always say that they sacrificed time with me on Fridays, because Fridays I would go to sleep early so that I could wake up early on Saturday. And to what you're sharing, I was only able to do that because I have a husband that was able to be home to watch the children, right? To like, he was dad. I mean, he's always dad. But in those moments, I was able to go out to be the runner and not feel guilty or not feel rushed or not feel strained, because I had someone at home that was picking up the parenting load, that was
Yeah.
doing those items. And that's, again, when people say it's free, I'm like, okay, but free for who? Because if you're a single
Yeah.
parent or you don't have the support, you can't just go out and run. Or if you live in a neighborhood that doesn't have safe streets, sidewalks, or whatever the case is,
Mhm.
trees that offer coverage, like, then you're either driving somewhere, traveling somewhere. And that, again, and you said it right, that's time. It's
Mhm.
time that you have to. And for me, it's like, right now, the Airbnb that we're staying in, I have to drive 5 minutes to go somewhere that I feel safe running. 5 minutes isn't a lot, but it's still like, that's something that I need to take into account.
Yeah.
The Airbnb that I was at prior to this one, I had to drive 20 minutes to get somewhere that I felt safe. And it's like one of those things where, again, it's, I have access to a car so I can drive. I
Mhm.
have the ability to pay for gas so that I can get there. And then I have a husband who's at home who can help get the girls going in the morning so that they're ready for school. There's so much more that goes into it. And now that I'm saying all of this, I'm curious, in your experience or in any of the research that you've found, what are some of the insights, or what are things in terms of like the female experience with running that's different from the male experience with running?
I think a huge one is a sense of safety. Um, Even down to, so this has been a really interesting, it's the time of year where this conversation always comes up because it's getting darker earlier. The clocks change in the UK soon. You know, people aren't able to go out after work quite so easily to run and things like that. So it's always something that comes up. So it's been on my radar a lot over the last couple of days. And I think it really is safety. One of but that doesn't just include the dark. One of the things that's come up, I do some work with an organization called She Racers, which is founded by Sophie Power, who's an ultra runner. And they advocate for getting more women onto race start lines. And some of the things that they found in a survey that they did was that kind of women feeling threatened out on courses. So, particularly by people like staff and photographers who perhaps haven't had background checks,
Mm.
women being stalked by prior partners because their names have been in an entrance list that's been published. Same goes for dot watching. We all love to dot watch, but actually, is there an opt out for dot watching? Because if you have a violent or threatening former partner or something along those lines, then actually you don't want somebody to know where you are. Um, Obviously, Strava's made improvements around privacy and things like that, and people are much more aware of that, so that's beneficial. There are people doing work around the design of cities and the design of municipal kind of activity areas, that because they're not designed with women in mind, they're not necessarily well lit. So for example, Battersea Park in London, beautiful park, it's right on the river, it's by Battersea Power Station. I do a lot of work there. One of my other jobs when I'm not researching is as an event manager for a running company, and I go out and I manage races. Um, and it's great, and I really, really love it. And we do a lot of races in Battersea Park because it's a fantastic venue. It's fast, it's flat. We can get people going around in 15 minutes on a 5K, and it's fun. But you do notice at the end of the night, it's really dark. And there's a running track there which does track sessions. And although there's a bit more lighting around the track area, to get out of the park and to get to public transport, it's a little bit of a walk. And I feel relatively safe because I'm on my bike usually. So I can kind of out pedal most people. But if you've got to walk through on your own, that's actually quite intimidating. And I didn't go to that track for years because of it, because it just seemed too inaccessible, because it was far away from public transport, relatively speaking, and it was dark. And that's a really good example of kind of recreational design that's letting women down.
Hmm.
The other big challenge I have at the moment, and we touched on this earlier, is we make it women's responsibility to find ways around situations, ways for them to make themselves feel safe. It's like, carry a rape alarm, go out in groups, you know, don't draw attention to yourself, run in well-lit areas, do X, do Y, do Z. So we're putting this additional burden on women of thinking of solutions to a problem that they didn't create, a systemic problem. And I say this with the greatest of respects to men. Most of them don't get it. They don't get it. And they even even men who are really alive to these issues and engaged in them and care about women's safety, like my husband, for example. I mean, he lives with a feminist researcher. He gets the stuff. He doesn't really get what it's like to walk along a street at night and not know whether the guy behind you is just like a nice normal bloke or somebody who has ill intentions, because actually you can't tell the difference. You know, violent men look like nice men. They don't have a warning sign on them. And I think that's one of the things that doesn't always get understood. Like I was listening or reading something recently where somebody said whenever they advocate on these things, there's statistics that are always thrown up about how young men are more, at least in the UK, more likely to experience violence in public places. But actually the comeback to that is, yeah, but young men are more likely to go out in public places after dark than young women who moderate their behaviour. And that's a big one. I think we don't have infrastructure that's designed for women, and we don't have a culture that really understands what it's like to be a woman. We have, every so often there's huge kind of media outcry because a woman has been attacked or killed. There's been some horrific examples in the last few years that have been devastating. But whether or not that actually changes anything in terms of how much our government understands, again, in the UK, we have some issues around policing at the moment in terms of sexual harassment, endemic misogynistic behaviour. How do we think about women's safety without burdening women with, okay, have I got my trainers? Have I got my phone? Have I got my watch? Have I got my rape alarm? It's another thing to have to think about that we don't need.
Oh yeah. So I've got just so much to say about that. Because that in the States, we had last year, Eliza Fletcher was something that just got lots of headlines. And the discourse around it was very infuriating, but also incredibly fascinating, because on the one hand, there were men who just didn't get it. And then on the other hand, there were women as well, who were admonishing her. Why did she go out at that time? Why did she do that? And I mean, and there were people that I was, again, like, I find social media to be really fascinating when things like that happen. I definitely have to put boundaries around my consumption of it, because I do go down rabbit holes. I just get so fascinated by how people understand something, how they contextualize it, and how you and I can see the same bit of information and yet have vastly different processing of that information. And that was something that I remember last year I posted something about it, about how angry I was that when I go out to run, I have my headlamp so that I'm visible. But at the same time, I'm like, do I want to be visible? Do I want a headlamp so that people know where I am? But I do, but I don't. I have Go Guarded. They make this ring that has like a plastic serrated knife on it, so that it doesn't injure me when I'm running. But if I punch someone, it's gonna hurt them. I run
Yeah.
with mace in my other hand. I don't run with headphones so that I could hear everything that's around me. I am taking every single precaution that I can. And like I just shared, I drive to places where I feel safer because I know there's other runners out there. But some of the comments were, why was she out at that time? Why was she by herself? And I'm like, hi, that's me. Like I'm someone who
Mm.
runs by myself during the week before my kids go to school, because that's when it works for me. If I don't run first thing in the morning, it's not going to happen at any other point. Because if not, I'm going to be running at 12 o'clock. I'm going to be running middle of the day. And guess what? That does not make me happy. It actually really frustrates me.
Yep.
So again, what was really fascinating was that it was other women that were saying things like that. And
Yep.
so yes, this is where I love how you say like it's a societal issue, because it's not
Yep.
just the men that don't know, but then it's also there's certain women that fuel that of, well, I wouldn't do that. And it's like, that's great that you wouldn't do that because you have the choice, right? Like you have a choice to do something differently. Not everyone has either the same luxury or the same privilege to make the choices that you're making. So instead of saying, why was she doing that, which is victim blaming, how about we question, why did that person feel like they were entitled to take another person's life? Why did
For
that
sure.
person feel like they were entitled to cause someone harm? And I think, again, I'm happy we have social media because we are talking about these things more
Mhm.
often. I feel like when I first started running, I never really heard of women being attacked. I just knew I don't feel safe around men like that. That's just it. Like, I know I don't feel safe around men. I just knew that there would be times where I go out to run and men drive by me and they're honking. And there was an incident, I think it's probably like 2 years ago, where I got a late start on my run for whatever reason. I don't know, I wanted to sleep in, and I ran around my neighborhood, and it was daytime, like early morning, maybe 7 a.m. And there were these two men on a corner, and they're like, hi, you looking good, can I run with you? And I gave them the middle finger.
Yeah.
So if you're watching this
Yep.
video, I'm giving a middle finger, and I gave them a middle finger. And then afterwards, I was like, dang it, why did I give them the middle finger? What if they follow me? So I ended up doing like an extra loop somewhere instead of, but again, like the fear took over. So instead of going straight home where I knew I would be safe, I did an extra loop because I didn't want them to see where I lived, just in
Yep.
case they decided to follow me. And I got home and I told my husband this story, and he's like, well, you just shouldn't have given them the middle finger. And I'm like, yeah, but how about they just shouldn't have said anything to me? How about they just
For
should have
sure.
let me run in peace? I appreciate when people say, like, if there's this happened to me on a recent long run, and I was like, that's how a man should talk to a woman when she's running. Because he was in a car and he drove past me. He's like, you're going 8 miles per hour, great job. And I was like, yes, thank you, I'll take that. Like, yeah, I'll take you telling me what my pace is. Versus, had he said anything else, I would have felt incredibly uncomfortable and I would have turned around. Like, I would have been like, where are you driving? And let me go in the opposite direction.
Mm.
But because he said, you're going 8 miles per hour, great job, I felt comfortable. I was like, okay, we're good here. So I guess I share all that to ask you, how do we engage in these conversations when
Sorry,
it's
that's my dog.
no, you're good.
He
Um,
heard something.
yeah, I was like, did I say something? No. So I guess the question I have for you now is just, how do we engage in these conversations so that people, and I say people, so that people start to shift from victim blaming to perpetrator blaming?
Okay. So I think we have to almost go back a step and it's helping people understand why they think the way that they think about social phenomena. Because we all think we're average, we all think we're in the middle, and generally we're all very, very different. We're a diverse community of people. So the first avenue, I think, that needs to be reflected on, and it goes to the kind of women who are victim blaming, is ideas around internalized misogyny. So, and this also links into the second part, which is something I address quite a lot in my research, and it comes out of some work by a couple of British academics at Bath University, which is this idea called post-industrial DIY post-feminism. And it's this idea of, well, I did it, so why can't everybody do it? And both of those perspectives, there's a little bit of intermingling between them. So, and from my perspective, from everything I've read, and the simplest way to condense it down is they're both almost a means of survival in a heavily male-dominated society that privileges men. And in order to thrive on a personal level, quite often you have to adapt to the status quo and adopt the universally accepted narratives. So these women are not they wouldn't identify themselves as misogynists at all, but they have internalized and adopted the misogynist ideas that perpetuated about how women should behave in society because it's protective to them. Because if you lean into what's being adopted, you're not at personal threat. So it's saying, if you've always been told because of cultural ideology, you are a girl, so you should not go out running on your own at 6 a.m. You'll believe that. So that when something horrible happens to a woman who was out running at 6 a.m., these women go, well, why was she doing that? Everybody knows women should go out running at 6 a.m. And people who believe that aren't bad. They're not bad people. It's just this ideology is really deeply ingrained in our society. The other perspective, this DIY post-feminism, you see it amongst all sorts of women of all ages, but predominantly younger, successful women, particularly women from quite privileged backgrounds, I find. And it's this idea of, well, I did it, so if you want to do something, just go and do it. Forgetting that it's not actually that easy for lots of women, for lots of different reasons, within a financial, social, whether they live somewhere where maybe it's less safe to go out, all these different reasons that come together, or these barriers that build up. And again, they're not ill-intended comments. They're supposed to be quite motivational usually. It's like, oh, just give it a go, just try, you'll like it when you try it. But they neglect the complexity of people's situations and what it is to be a human, because that's hard. Doing something that scares you, where you don't feel like you fit in, you don't feel like you belong, is really, really hard. Like, even now, there's certain running clubs in London which are full of incredibly beautiful, incredibly fast people. I won't go within like a mile of them. I just won't. Like, I'm 38, I've had a kid, I'm not very fast at all, which I don't mind. I enjoy that, but it's just not my tribe. And that's intimidating. For me, that would be really scary. And I've been running for 10 years. Imagine saying it to a woman who's who like kind of likes the idea of running, but is really scared. They might or might not kind of be a different body shape from the aesthetic ideals that society tells us they should be. All these things come together. It's not as easy as saying, well, just give it a go, because it's not. So those are the things that I think underpin the answer to that question. And that's really what the work and advocacy I do on social media is about, is helping people to understand how basically those two things manifest in just the way we talk about running day to day.
Yeah. And that's something that I've had multiple conversations on this podcast about, and just in general outside of podcasts. That's always what I talk about with my running friends in terms of an idea or the sense of belonging within the running community. Even I've shared my own personal experience with going to different run clubs and how I take issue when run clubs say all paces welcome when it's really not all paces welcome.
Yes.
Yeah, I take issue with that. I've had the experience earlier this year where I went to a run club, and similar to you, I mean, I've been running for over a decade now. I
Mm,
consider myself a pretty knowledgeable runner. I consider myself an advanced runner, and not advanced because I'm PRing left and right, but advanced because I've been running long enough to understand my body and
mhm.
what my body needs from me when I run, before I run, and after I run. So that's where I consider myself an advanced runner of just feeling really tuned in to my experience as a runner when I'm running. And I went to a run club and I even messaged them and said, "Hey, all paces, like, what does this mean?" And they're like, "Yeah, all paces, come." And I realized, and it really, really hit me this year, that when people say all paces welcome, what they're really saying is you have to be able to run a mile in about 9.5 minutes or 10 minutes, at least here in the States. I don't know if it's the
Same
same
here.
here. Okay. So now that I know that, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, I'm still kind of processing it, where I have so much hesitation. I lack the confidence to go to run clubs because I'm and again, I consider myself an advanced runner, and this is probably why. It's because I'm not going to sacrifice my experience to try to keep up with somebody else. So
Yes.
I like, if I need to run easy, I'm going to run easy. I'm just looking for some company when when I
Yeah.
want to go in a run club and whatnot. I'm not going to risk injuring myself or just overdoing it because I'm trying to keep up with people. So I understand that. And I love that you said someone who's newer to the sport, because here you and I are talking about people who are not necessarily new to the sport, and there's still that, again, for me it's the lack of confidence of going to these new groups, because there is a level of vulnerability with going to a run club or going to a group and saying, "Hi, I want to belong, please don't leave me behind." And yet then they do. And I I'm used to running by myself and running on my own, but I also really love runners. Like, they're such
Mhm.
great people to talk to and to spend time with. And yet this whole idea of all paces welcome, or this whole idea of you have to look a certain way or be a certain way or wear certain gear or certain clothes or whatever the case
Mhm.
is. I mean, I call all of that stuff, those are the gatekeepers of the sport. Like, there's
Yes.
all these little gates that we have to
Yep.
get through,
Yep.
that really, when we stop to think about it, it's amazing that a lot of people even start. And I
Mm.
find, and I don't know if in your experience and in the research you've done, where this is another topic that I'm so fascinated with, is how difficult it is for people, particularly women, to feel comfortable calling themselves runners.
Oh, I think that's so interesting. I've not done any research on it. I think it would make a really interesting project. Anecdotally, I think women struggle. The amount of people who apologize about their pace. So, again, my work encompasses pace inclusivity. Um, and I've talked a lot about pace inclusivity. There was a running club in London that was advertising all abilities, where actually their easy pace was a 10-minute mile. The park run average time for a park run in the UK is 38 minutes. So a 10-minute mile is not an easy run for a lot of people. Um, and yeah, I think it's kind of off the back of that conversation. a lot of women in particular are really self-conscious about their running performance. And now, like, one way of thinking about it potentially, and again, I've not researched this isn't underpinned by anything other than my brain working at the moment, is that women's bodies historically have been so scrutinized. Aesthetics was one of the reasons why women weren't permitted to participate in sport for a long time. It's ungainly and unladylike, and our wombs might fall out. And true story. And performance in the body and the use of the body in performance, and women's bodies, you know, their embodiment, performance and embodiment, and the way the body moves, the way the body performs as a runner, all contributes to pace. And then when you're starting to kind of, I'm not saying this especially well because I'm literally thinking about it as I talk at the moment. This is the process. You literally, that link between bodies, and women have been trained to discipline their bodies in particular ways and to perform their bodies in particular ways. And then pace almost becomes a characterization of that embodiment. So it's lots of Michael Foucault kind of bodily discipline stuff for any of the sociology nerds out there. That all comes into it. So it suddenly becomes a direct connector between how you feel in your embodied self and your performance. And, you know, we can't forget as well, sport has historically been a man's world. We were banned from football because we were too good at it and attracted too many crowds. Like, women didn't run in the marathon, Olympic marathon, into the 80s. So, you know, 40 years ago. So there's a lot of kind of social and historical baggage around women participating, which at an individual level can manifest in baggage when it comes to how you perform and what performance means and what running means. And again, we very much constructed running as being about how fast you run and how far you run, when actually there are lots of different ways to conceptualize the sport, how it feels, how it makes you feel, your community and the social element of it. And like, for me personally, that's a huge part of running. Running culture, you know, all that type of thing comes into it. But there's so often a narrow definition of what running is. And again, in my work on ultra running, that's something that I've looked at, because ultra running arguably destabilizes the meaning of performance for women, because it becomes about how far rather than what pace. People, you can awe somebody when you say you've run 100 miles. Like, people just go wow, and they don't ask you what time you did it in. Whereas with a marathon, the first question they want to ask you is, what time did you do? It's like, well, no. Why don't you ask me how it felt, how the day went, you know, what was the high point, what was the low point? So there's lots of that wrapped up in it as well. Is, you know, from the work that I've done in ultra running, that's one effort to destabilize what running means. But there's also a movement on social media around pace inclusivity and reframing what running means, that destabilizes those ideas about running only being defined by time and performance, and what a runner is as time and performance, as opposed to, you know, community, how it feels, the time outside, etc., etc.
Yeah, that's definitely been something that I've seen a shift within the running community. And I don't know if it's also because I'm experiencing that shift with my own personal relationship with running. So maybe I'm just seeing it more elsewhere, right? Where my vision or my gaze has shifted, which then shifts everything else I take in. But that is something that I wish I could get everyone to understand, that the minute you subtract yourself from running being exclusively about performance and pace, you're going to find so much more joy and longevity in the sport, because it's no longer about this race and about finishing in that time. It's about something greater. And I had even just like a light bulb moment of, you are so on point with the fact that with a marathon, and it frustrates me to no end when people are like, so how'd you do? How fast? How, like, and it's never like what time, it's how fast did you run it in? And it's like, oh no, don't talk to me about that. Like, or people automatically, I have a marathon coming up next weekend. And the question is, what's your time goal? And I'm like, I really don't have one. I'm like, my goal is to finish wanting to do another one. Why can't that goal be enough? But
did you hear about Tina Moore's concept of a joy PB?
no.
So she said this after London Marathon, and it really encapsulates what I aim for when I run. But it's a joy personal best. It's finding joy in the event that you're participating in. So how did it feel? Were you consistent? Like, what did it mean to you on a more personal level? Because I make a point, I don't share my race times, and it's really annoyed some people. I've had some like fantastic trolling about it. It's great. And it's not because, I mean, I'll be upfront, I'm a 5.5 hour marathon runner. There's no shame attached to that. It's not because of that. It's because my time doesn't matter. How it made me feel matters.
Absolutely.
And yes, I adopted this after Tina used it. I adopted it because it's just really captures, this is our hobby. It's not our
Yeah.
job.
Yeah.
It should feel good. We should make us happy.
Yeah. I mean, that's been again, for me, I feel like, and maybe you kind of feel the same way, where it's, sometimes I feel like I'm going against the running current because I am trying to get myself in the alignment with, how do I feel? How do I want to feel? And then with the people that I work with, it's very much that. It's like, I had an athlete that for her races, I was like, I want you to pick a word, one word for how you want to feel. And then let that word be your mantra. Like, let that word be what you focus on when you're racing. Because again, for me, I had the experience of being someone who went after time goals, and running was incredibly unfulfilling and stressful for me, because when I didn't reach my time goals, guess what? I felt like a failure and I felt disappointed. Whereas if I focus on, how do I want to feel in this experience? If joy was, I actually ran the London Marathon this year as well. And
Did you?
yeah, I did. And for that race, my word was joy. And anytime I was in that race and I felt like I was struggling, because newsflash, y'all, a marathon hurts. It's going to hurt. And there's going to be points in it where you're going to be like, I can't believe I'm doing this. But in those moments where I was hitting that, I can't believe I'm doing this, I came back to joy. Okay, how do I need to experience joy right now? How do I need to feel joy right now? And with the London Marathon, you know how I got that joyful feeling? By taking a moment to look around me, to see all the charity runners that were there, to stop and remember that the majority of the people who run that race are running on behalf of someone who cannot. And all of a sudden it was like, I'm not going to complain about my legs hurting. I'm not going to complain about my butt hurting. I'm not, because there's something greater happening here today. The organization that I ran a part of, they don't care about my time. They didn't care. They were just happy that I was out there on that course representing them, that I was fundraising for the work that they were doing. And that's something that after London, I'm like, everyone needs to run London so they can experience that, how running is something bigger than your finish time, how running means something more than how quickly you can get from start line to finish line. And it's not to take away from people who have those goals, because they are very motivating for some people.
Yeah.
But it is just, for me, it's always an invitation to, let's look at the long game of running, right? Because I'm sure you know it, and I know it, that I can set a time goal for this race. And if I meet that time goal, You know how often, like how long I'm going to stay celebrating that accomplishment? Like maybe a week before I start setting my eyes on a different time goal that's even faster than that. Whereas if I focus on joy, there's no taking that experience away from me. Like I'm going to sit in that feeling for a long, long time. So I really do love that you brought that up, because joy personal best is great, but also the difference between marathons and the ultra distances, because you're so right. Like I follow so many ultra runners, and never once do I think, how fast that they did that. Like, how fast did they do that? I don't think that. I just am so impressed that their body was able to move
I
that
know.
amount of distance. So it's so interesting, again, when you're talking about how we're socialized, even as runners, how we're socialized to think that, okay, you've done a 5K, now you should do a 10K. You've done the 10K, now you should do a half marathon. You've done a half marathon, you should do a marathon. And now the dialogue is definitely, okay, do the ultra distance. It's amazing. It's just totally, again, like a light bulb moment of, we're socialized and don't even realize it. I'm like, I
Yeah.
didn't really think about that.
Yeah.
Um,
It's cool, isn't it? It's so interesting. Like, and London Marathon's always such an interesting one as well. Like, as a Brit, where as somebody kind of, I was born in London and I've lived here for nearly, or at least 15 years now, because I came back after university. And, London Marathon, if you're a runner in London, London Marathon is like a big thing. Even if you're not a runner in London, it's a big thing. And I think sometimes the fact that it's 26.2 miles gets overlooked. The fact that it's so far and that it requires, huge build up, and it, it people kind of almost assume that everybody just does it as well, which one is really hard to get into. um, I had a ballot place that I managed to defer because I was pregnant and then recovering from pregnancy, but it's hard. Um, but it is a very, very special marathon. It's just, it kind of almost gets taken for granted as, oh, you're just going to do London then. All right then. Not everybody should do London. And it's like, no, it's really hard.
yeah, and when you're talking about, and this is something that came up recently, with, again, I'm gonna kind of bring it up here, and maybe this is where where our conversation will go. And for those of you who don't know, there's the recently Boston Marathon announced how many people got into the Boston Marathon, and it was, this year the buffer was 5 minutes and 29 seconds. So even though you may get a qualifying time to run the Boston Marathon, that does not guarantee that you actually get a spot to run the race. And this race, every single year, I want to run Boston one year because of my 6 stars. I want to get the marathon major 6 star. I don't think I'll ever be anyone who qualifies for Boston, because mentally there's a whole different mental game there. And for me, again, knowing myself, that if I run with joy as the goal, then I enjoy the process. But if I run with time as the goal, running becomes a chore and very unsatisfying for me. And to what you said, this is my hobby. This is something that I am carving time out to do. So I need to have fun while I'm doing it. And that's just my experience. But you had this race, and every year, the big question is, how big is the buffer going to be in order to get into the race? And every year I get so frustrated with it, because part of the dialogue ends up being how charity runners take spots away from qualified runners. I love the face that you're making, y'all. If you can watch this on YouTube, you need to, just so you can see our faces throughout this conversation, because it's so great. But that's something that every single year I feel like it comes up. And this year, of course, it came up because the buffer was, I think, the second highest buffer in in the last decade. A lot of people did not get in. There was, I think it was like 33,000 people applied, but only 22,000 of those got in. And some of the comments then, Okay, let's kind of fast forward. I'll try to be concise and then you can kind of fill in the gaps where I'm missing pieces. But then Tracksmith, which is a clothing brand here in the States. I don't know if you all have them over there.
We do,
But
yeah. We have.
okay, so then they published something. First of all, they quoted
Jock
someone
Semple.
that maybe was not
Yeah.
the best person to quote on how Boston is not a jogging race, something along those lines. And then how they are creating a singlet that is exclusive to people who qualified and had a place in the race. That's kind of just bullet points. The comment section on that was phenomenal. Again, I was up at night, like reading it. Like I was like, I need popcorn here because I just need to kind of understand. I like to understand all the positions, but inevitably it got to people getting really defensive about it and how people earn their way in. Whereas there are people who run for charity and they buy their entry into the race, which I take issue, especially as someone who has done quite a bit of fundraising for different races. And I tell people this all the time. I'm like, running a marathon is one thing. That's hard enough. Running a marathon as a charity runner, hands down, even harder. Even harder because not
So
only
hard.
do you have the stress of your training, but you also have the stress of meeting a fundraising goal. And depending on the charity that you're fundraising for, I've fundraised for charities that I have to have my goal amount met before the race. And if it's not met before the race, I cannot run the race. Imagine how stressful that is, y'all. Okay. I've had races where the fundraising goal can be met afterwards, but it's still, again, seeing that dialogue where I'm like, we have a problem with elitism in the sport. So I bring that up because, again, going back to what I said in the beginning, that's how I found you.
Yeah.
Now that we're kind of a few weeks removed from that, what are your thoughts? What did I miss in telling the story? And just from that sociologist perspective, what does it say about running as a whole?
Yes, I think there's a couple of things going on here. The first thing is the buffer. So they applied the same buffer for men and women. And actually that disadvantages women quite often. And say cut-off times are not my specialty, but they are something that we know stands in the way of women when it comes to participating. Because if the cut-off time is on an average pace of a man, and it's a male heavy race, then actually women are going to have to work much harder to reach that cutoff time. So although Boston has obviously a men's qualifying time and a women's qualifying time, to cut them by the same minutes rather than the same proportion technically would make things a little bit harder for women compared to their male counterparts. However, that's kind of almost a side issue. That wasn't the thing that got people going. So the thing that got people going was this post from Tracksmith. And in fact, I'm going to pull it up because I'm going to need to go back to it.
Yes, because you had a whole series of posts. It was actually your post that I was sending to people because by the time I was talking to people about it, Tracksmith had removed the original post. So I was like, this is the one she breaks it down. You break it down.
Okay, so the first thing to say is there's absolutely nothing to do with the singlet.
Yep.
There's no issue with races having special limited edition merch for specific people. Tracksmith have always done it for participants. And, you know, it's fine, like, whatever. If I had qualified and I had got in, had a secured place, I'd be all over that. So that's the first thing. And I think that's what a lot of people missed.
I love the way you're like, it's fine, it's whatever.
It is. It's like, it's just a singlet. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
That's not the point of the issue that a lot of people were raising. What people were raising was about the way that they'd framed this. So they'd opened with a quote from Jock Semple. And Jock Semple was the course official who pulled Catherine Switzer off the course. Doesn't have the best record when it comes to inclusivity. So it's a little bit tone deaf to be using a quote from him. And I understood they took his name out a bit before they deleted the post, but it's still a bit of an awkward one. I'm actually working on something at the moment around the difference between jogging and running. But it's always been a little bit of a contentious issue. I mean, you can also make the argument, and again, I have nothing to substantiate this, I'm still researching it, but potentially jogging has been synonymous with women and seen as a lesser activity than running, whatever. So there's that element to it. Again, that's not really what this post was getting at. It's basically the way it could be understood, and the way a lot of people did understand it, was that if you worked hard enough, you get into Boston. And it failed to acknowledge the diversity of experience in running. It was elitist. It kind of reinforced pretty outdated ideas about what running is, and I'm absolutely not saying we shouldn't celebrate achievement. I think it's amazing when that's people's goal and that they achieve it. I have nothing against people aiming for time sensitive goals or for races with entry criteria, as long as that criteria is made clear. I have no problem with it. If that's what drives you and that's what you want to do, I'll cheer you on. That's awesome. The issue was that the wording reinforced elitism and exclusivity in a way that's really unhelpful and becomes really divisive in the community. So, it was out of step with the direction that we're going in as a running community. It was quite snobby. It was a bit uncomfortable. And it reinforces the idea that if you're not performing at a particular level, it's because you're not working hard enough, which is just not true. It's just not true. And yes, like somebody raised it with me that the statistics from Strava show that BQ qualifiers typically do train a bit more. They typically do get a few more marks, but that also neglects the diversity of experience. It neglects that not everybody has the same opportunity and not everybody's coming from the same starting point. And that actually for some people working hard is going to look different because they have different structures in their life that they need to navigate. So we can't assume that everybody is coming from the same starting point. And I think that's the point that I was trying to get to, was this is a company that says for runners, for sport, for the love as their tagline, but it wasn't reflected in their post. And it suggested that you're only a runner if you achieve a particular standard. And Carolyn C, she made great points on this, and she's a tracksmith athlete. But she basically said, for all their talk about championing the amateur, their media continues to portray a very narrow slice of the running world, thin, white, affluent, and fast. And it does have a very preppy image. It has a particular image it cultivates. But then it's saying different things. And I also know on a community level, tracksmith can actually be very diverse. And they've built great communities. So it's almost even more of a letdown that their media post didn't reflect this. Now, you have to give absolute props to tracksmith for acknowledging what they did wrong. Very, very few companies do that. And I mean, it's a low bar, but to have a company actually come out and say, listen, heads up, we got this wrong. It's, we're going to review this, is great. And I don't want to denigrate tracksmith. I wear their kit. I like their kit. I think their communities are great. I think they've really cultivated a community feeling. I think we do have to be a little bit careful around kind of community hanging on brands, because that can be a kind of imbalanced power relationship. And some of the brand loyalty that came through in the responses around this was wild.
Oh, it was great. I mean, like I said, I was up at night reading everything. And it was one of those things where, again, like I was just like, I had to take a moment and say, well, I still support Tracksmith. I mean, I think I own a pair of their socks. Like I really, and even then it was socks that were given to me for free at a Chicago marathon. Like there wasn't, it's not necessarily a brand that I had on my radar that I use, but it was so interesting again to see how everyone came out and who was commenting on it, because I feel like it's been a minute since we've had some real big controversy in running like that. And it was totally, I just couldn't stop consuming it. Like I couldn't stop reading it. I couldn't stop the different viewpoints of it, how attached certain people are to this idea of being a runner equals performance, and how other people came and were talking about that message of inclusivity. And even there was someone's comment that I shared in my stories, because she said that this post is exactly why I have trouble calling myself a runner. So there were just so many different layers to it. I mean, I really did feel like, I guess like a fractal, maybe, for, I don't, where it's like there's so many different sides to it. There were so many different perspectives, so many big feelings involved, where I think a lot of people were taking it very, very personally. And
Yeah.
once we start taking it personally, we're not even able to have the dialogue. And like you
Yeah.
said, it wasn't about the singlet. It's not that. Like
It's not even
it's
really about
not.
Tracksmith,
No,
to
no,
be
no, it
honest.
wasn't. Exactly. It wasn't even really just,
No.
it wasn't Tracksmith. Honestly, it was, if you're gonna point a finger at Tracksmith, it's gonna be like, hey, whoever decided to okay this post, like the marketing bit of how many hands does a post like this with a caption like that, how many hands does it go through before you actually post it? Or even, are you reading what you're saying, and does it make sense, right? Because there's, again, going back to what I said earlier about, there's just so many different points of gatekeeping in the sport, that I guess what I realized from it is that it's a both and situation. Like you can be both really proud of having earned a spot to earn a singlet, and you can also recognize that maybe that wording kind of pushes people away from the sport.
Yeah.
Both things can be true. And
Yeah.
again,
This
like,
is the thing I think, and this is one of the challenges, I think, particularly with social media, is people are almost pushed into polarizing views because it's a soundbite. Like, I am absolutely not shitting on Tracksmith at all. It's, you know, and I respect that they put an apology out, but it's, from my perspective, it's a great educational case study to show, okay, this is why words we use really matter. Like, I'd put this up in front of, I occasionally do bits of teaching for a master's program, and I'd put this up in a classroom. These slides would go up in a classroom, and I'd kind of be like, let's talk about this. This is why the words that we use about sport really matters. And, I went as far as, I did write them an alternative blurb, because you can celebrate success. You can celebrate having big goals. You can celebrate time sensitive goals. Everybody, but you can also acknowledge the diversity of experience, and that different people maybe want different things, without kind of suggesting that you're not really a runner unless you've qualified and got a place in Boston. Because it does reinforce that elitism that we don't really need. And we know, again, that a lot of the work they're doing at the grassroots or kind of store level, and with people like Carolyn, is about increasing diversity. So it was, from my point of view, I put it out there not as a protest, as a education, and all the posts I do actually are generally education pieces, kind of taking case studies of current issues and going, yeah, this is why this matters. This is why this is problematic. This is why we need to think about this. Rather than saying boycott Tracksmith, or, no, there shouldn't be singlets. It's like,
yeah, that's why,
it.
that's why I say it was your post that I share with people, because of that. Because again,
Yeah.
I saw it as like, it's a both and, like it's a little bit of everything. There's a lot of thoughts, a lot of perspectives.
Yeah.
everything can exist. And where I truly take issue, again, I take issue with the charity, like the poo-pooing on charity
Yeah,
runners when
I think
they're
that's really
working.
unfair.
Yeah, when they're working really, really hard. I mean, I was looking into it the other day and it's like you have these charity runners that they need to raise $10,000 plus 10,000 US dollars
Yeah.
plus they have to pay for the entry into the race, right? So it's not like your entry's
I
included.
read once as well, they were quite often people who'd already done other races and raised a lot as well. So there's like this almost this pipeline. And
Yep.
like as you
Oh
said,
yeah.
taking on the burden of raising a lot of
Yeah.
money
I
is
looked into
huge.
several applications. Sorry. I looked into several applications, and that was one of the questions. What fundraising experience do you have, and how much have you raised before? And it's like, oh, okay. It's not, that's an
Yeah.
accessibility issue as well with that race.
Well,
Um,
yeah, if you don't have that experience, and to be honest, if you don't have contacts who are able to donate significant sums of money, then it gets really hard. And also, you know, Boston has always had runners who have fundraised or who there as legacy and all sorts of things. It's not new. And it's they're not taking places because again, well, at least in London, the charity runners actually subsidize a lot of the infrastructure. So the charities pay quite substantial rates for those places, whereas comparatively speaking, London is one of the more affordable majors if you have a general entry. So it's about 50-60 quid.
yep.
It's pretty $60-70 to enter London. And that's because it's subsidized by charity runners. So I don't know how the system works at Boston, but I imagine there's probably a little bit of that redistribution going on as well, because the
Absolutely.
infrastructure for a closed road big city marathon is insane.
Yeah. I
Like
mean,
it's huge.
again, I was looking into it the other day and it's like they have 40 charity partners.
Mm,
And from my experience of working with charities, there's a lot of cost that the charity has
mm,
in order to get those spots. So the charity does pay for those spots. It's not like the spots are given to the charities.
no.
There is a cost. So I just always find that particular discourse regarding Boston incredibly fascinating because it's not, it's not, I feel like it's just so myopic of
Hmm.
saying that person who's running on a charity bib took away a spot from someone who quote unquote earned it with a Boston qualifying time. And it's like, no, if you actually look at how the race is set up, there are, and no one complains about a spot being taken away for an elite athlete, right? Like no one complains about
Or
that,
a brand partner, because
or a
there are
brand
brand
partner.
places as well.
Thank
Like
you.
I know a friend of mine had a place with a brand partner, and she did receive a bit of pushback from people about it, which again I think is unfair because it's a form of hospitality for a brand that is pumping significant money into a race. I think sometimes what gets forgotten is races are fundamentally businesses.
Yes.
And these races, this is not your kind of mom and pop turkey trot vibe. These are like the races I work on typically have 600 to 3,000 people. They're relatively small, but even then, our infrastructure is still pretty, robust. These races are on another level. They are businesses, and they need to pay for things. So they need the sponsors, and actually, as part of the sponsorship deal, the sponsor will be given X number of bibs to give as hospitality. They need the charities because actually those charity places bolster the mass run, but also there's a CSR, corporate social responsibility element to it. There's a historical element to it. London has always been a huge charity fundraising race, so there's that bit to it. that all ties in. And that's how a lot of very ordinary people end up running, is because something happens in their lives that motivates them to do something for a charity. So
Yeah.
you hear amazing stories coming out of London Marathon. So there's that dimension to it as well. These are complex operations with lots going on. It's not, if we expect purity of running from a big operation, actually we're misplaced and we're going to feel let down. I think we need to actually see it for what it is. It's an amazing experience, it's an uplifting experience, but it's also a business providing services, and you need to factor all that in and factor the impact out on that as well. So again, like London Marathon supports a huge number of charity partners in the community that are working to get kids more involved, to help people with accessibility needs get more involved. There's lots of things going on that aren't necessarily seen beneath the surface. Could they do better at some things? One of my issues with them is gender diversity in women over 30. I wrote a blog post about it, that there is a drop off in diversity in the masses and general entry ballot isn't 50-50 by gender, it's just luck of the draw. Unlike the good for age, which is 50-50. But so they could improve that. They could be a bit more public about some of the work that they're doing, because I think it would reassure people. But generally, there are reasons why races operate the way that they do. They're not always just, but we have to understand what's business and what's then an equalities issue. And the two are not necessarily mutually inclusive.
Yeah. And it's a great invitation to just open your eyes. I don't know, like that to me is just like, look beyond your personal experience to try to see the wholeness of what's happening. And I want to thank you for bringing that element into the discussion of, at the end of the day, these are businesses, right? These are businesses and they need to capitalize where they can on something that's a very expensive endeavor, right? We're talking about your marathon, right? Depending on how many cities you're going through, the different police forces, the different medical community, like there is a lot that's happening that sometimes through just race entry, you're not going to be able to cover all those expenses, right? And then you're thinking about your race shirts and your medals, and there's a lot, the water that's provided on the course, there's a lot of expenses that go into that. And again, I just want to thank you for pointing that out.
And even though a lot of races do rely heavily on volunteers, there are professionals, there are people like me who are there on the day managing those situations, and we need to get paid. And that work is hard, it's long hours. There needs to be some recognition of that. And to some degree, I think it's amazing when people volunteer for races. It's so great. Like, I've done it. I have huge respect for it, but I don't think races should wholly rely. I think it should be the minority on the jobs that are less onerous. And otherwise it should be paid professionals who know exactly what they're doing, because that becomes an exploitation issue as well. So it's kind of making sure that volunteers don't get anything too onerous and that staff get paid fairly.
Yeah. Levels and layers to all of this.
So
right.
Many.
I have two more questions for you. And the first question is just for all the women that are listening and have been listening to this conversation. What is something that they can take away, or a message that you would want to pass on to them in terms of either getting involved with running or staying involved with running?
Okay. So the piece of advice I'm going to give is maybe not quite literally a piece of advice, but it's look beyond yourself. Look beyond your own experiences. Because if you're already involved in running, it can seem easy. So it's looking beyond that, looking at the experiences of other women and thinking about what you can do to help mobilize those women. Is it that, you can talk about running differently? Are the words you could use differently? Could you frame your participation differently?
Hmm.
Think about the messages you put out on social media, but also in your day-to-day face-to-face life. You know, how are you talking to your friends, your colleagues, your children about what running is and what running means? And I've been very privileged that I'm raising my daughter in an amazing, we're involved in Rundam Crew, which is an amazing diverse community of runners. Raising my daughter in that environment, so she's learning that running is about community and solidarity and supporting each other and celebrating every success, whatever that looks like. How are you communicating that in your own communities in a way that is positive and welcoming and opening? Or are you, without really realizing it, gatekeeping the sport? And like we all do it, I know I've done it in the past, you know. So that would be my advice for people who want to get involved. That's a really difficult question because it will depend so much on an individual's circumstances. You know, I can't say, oh, well, just do X or just do Y, because I don't know that individual's circumstances. I think thinking about why you want to do it, what it would mean to you, what maybe setting a little goal. So it doesn't have to be, you don't have to feel obliged to run in a particular way or in a particular frequency. But again, it's very difficult without knowing a person's context. So that's my advice, is actually, it's not on the women who haven't started yet. It's on those of us who are in the community already to think about how we talk about it, what we do, and to create the gateways for those women who might be mulling it over to come to us and say, hey, how do I get started? This is what my life looks like.
Yeah, I love that. The final question is just tell us where to find you. And it's a two-part question. So where do we find you? And what do you have coming up that we can celebrate you in?
So you can find me at Bethan Taylor-Swaine or feminist sports sociologist on Instagram. I'm probably more active on my own channel just because that's where I am most of the time. The sports sociology one is more of a repository for thoughts than anything else. I also have a website. It's www.bethantaylor-swaine.com. And the big thing on the horizon for me at the moment is that I'm trying to finish my PhD and get that done. I promised my husband that I won't register for races till I've done it. Already fallen down on that one because I'm supporting my mum through her first half marathon, which is the London Landmarks half marathon, next year. So that's my next running kind of goal, but it's very much as a kind of pacer supporter than a me thing, although totally a me thing because I love that race. It's so great.
Yeah. And I don't think, I think the deal you made with your husband still stands because this is you supporting your mom. So it's a totally different category of racing.
Exactly. Like we already just, I did a race, I did the Pace the Essex 10K in the summer and that didn't count. So
That's why I'm like, I don't think it counts. I think you're good. All right.
yeah.
Any final words for us?
No, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. It's so nice to connect with other women who have the same, I guess, mission as I do around deconstructing our sport essentially and making it a place that everybody can enjoy if they want to. And again, I get criticized for suggesting that all women should run only if you want to, but it's so nice to know that there are other women who are actively working to overcome these barriers and just to think a little differently about them.
Yeah. I think the more we can think about it and invite conversation, the better the sport is for everyone. Because
For
it's
sure.
been, at least for me personally, even just through having this podcast and talking to different people, so many moments of realization of, oh, the words that I was using or the suggestions that I was making, I thought I was being helpful, but they're not. So it's, and I don't take it personally. I just take it as, okay, if at the end of the day, my goal is to have more women, more people come into this sport, then I need to be wrong sometimes. And I need to learn how to be
Yeah.
better. And that's
Yeah.
it.
And we need that role models, because so often at the moment, learning is seen as, saying you're wrong isn't that accepted. And actually, we need people to step and go, yeah, hands up, I've got it wrong before, but I'm learning and I continue to learn.
Yeah. And it's through conversation that I figure it out, and it's fine. So I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast and just talking to me about all these issues and going down that little tracksmith rabbit hole with me, because that was something that was very timely and very fascinating for me, because even as you said it speaks to bigger issues and bigger themes within the running community. And it's just such a great anecdote or a great example for us to just jump off of and have those conversations. So thank you so much for talking to
Pleasure.
me. And y'all, we'll see you on the next episode. Bye.
Bye.